haven't heard before in terms of how to write a conclusion. What have you been taught should go in the conclusion of an essay? Quentin. Okay, so we've been taught, and this is what I was taught as well, summary of everything you said. Okay, so if I'm a reader and I just read your entire paper, and then you summarize everything you just said, is that going to be interesting for me to read? What am I going to be thinking in my head as I read that conclusion? I just read this. I'm going to be thinking in my head, will no blank. I know this. I just read it. Why did you just summarize it for me? Okay? So when we think about the word conclusion, let's think about conclusion from a scientific perspective. So in science class, what do you start your what do you start your I think I already did.
You did.
I did. Yep. Head of the game. What do you start a science experiment with? Before you start to do the experiment, what do? Come up with a hypothesis. Interesting. What is a hypothesis? Hypothesis is a prediction. What do you see in the word hypothesis that you see in an English class? Interesting. You see the word thesis, right? So you do your hypothesis, which is your prediction, and then what do, Devon? After you do your hypothesis, what do you then do?
Like as a scientific sense?
Yeah.
Evidence or something, for example.
Okay, so but big picture, what's the big thing that you do? Dylan? You have to do the experiment, right? So you give a hypothesis of this is what's going to happen in the experiment. Then you do the experiment. You do the experiment, you look at the evidence, and from the evidence, you draw a what? You draw a conclusion. Okay? So a conclusion is not a summary. That's not what a conclusion is. So we've actually been doing a bad job of teaching you conclusions, and I used to do this myself. A conclusion is not a summary. A conclusion is, now that we know this, this must be true. That's a conclusion. Right? So I'm going to hypothesize that if I let go of this paper, it's going to hit the floor. That's my hypothesis. Well, now we know when you drop paper, it hits the floor. I've made a conclusion. Okay? So how does that look in a paper? In a paper, it looks like this. You're basically answering two questions. You're answering the question, what must be true now that we know this? So if you have Bradley Cooper, and you talked about Bradley Cooper, and you talked about Gladwell, and you talked about yourself, and you covered these concepts, what must be true? Well, here's one thing that must be true. Now we know, ultimately, now we know that without hard work, we cannot be successful. That would be part of it. Okay? And then the second part of your conclusion is, why does this matter to everyone? So a conclusion is not long. It's usually between 3 and 5 sentences. And I can't give you a formula for, well, exactly, this is exactly how you do it, because you have different people, you had different concepts. But what must be true now that we know this, and why does it matter to everyone? Okay? So some good ways to end a paper or to start a conclusion would be to use words like, you could use thus, You could use therefore. You could use overall. You could use ultimately. You could use in the end. I generally, say don't use in conclusion because it's just so obvious. But that's what a conclusion does. A conclusion tells the reader, hey, I took you on this little journey through this information. I gave you my argument. Now that you know all this must be true, and this is why it matters. Does that make sense? Nod your head if it makes sense. Shake your head if it doesn't make sense. Stand up and do a jumping jack if you weren't listening. All right. Okay, get back to work. I'm going to come back at you in about 20 minutes to talk about formatting.